Good morning and welcome to the Rawls College of Business Center for Sales and Customer Relationship Excellence webinar, Leadership Insights, Secrets of the Amazon Invention Machine, featuring Bill Carr, former Amazon executive and co-author of the best-selling book, Working Backwards. We now welcome Dr. Atul Parvatiyar.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Julie, and welcome to everybody to this exciting webinar on the secrets of the Amazon Invention Machine. We have our featured speaker, Mr. Bill Carr, and before I introduce him to you, let me first and foremost also introduce our co-host for this event, Kimberly Graham. Kimberly is the Associate Vice President of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the Texas Tech University, and she runs the Innovation Hub, which is the hub for all startup companies, as well as for the research commercialization activities for the university. And Kimberly knows a lot about innovation as well as entrepreneurship. She has been involved with more than 270 startups and involved in terms of making West Texas an innovation hub. So Kimberly, welcome. You want to quickly say a few words before we get started with the program?
Absolutely. I want to welcome our speaker, Bill Carr. It's going to be a pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you, Dr. P. and Dean Margaret Williams for hosting this talk. The Innovation Hub is really excited to be a co-host and a part of bringing great speakers like Mr. Carr here to West Texas to experience some of his leadership and innovative thought leadership in with regards to Amazon and some of his other work. So thank you for making us a part of this.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. And it gives me great pleasure to first welcome our Dean Margaret Williams, who is really the champion behind the champions, as we say. You know, she gets all of us to do some exciting work, and she's a trailblazer and an outstanding leader. Let me kind of request Margaret Williams, Dean Margaret Williams, who's a professor of management, to welcome all of you. Dean Margaret Williams, please.
Thank you, Atul. I appreciate being part of these events. Whenever we get to collaborate with the Innovation Hub, I'm very excited. So Kimberly, thank you for your support of this talk today. We have a great partnership going with the Innovation Hub and love when we can do these kinds of things. Bill, I also want to welcome you to virtually to Texas Tech University. We wish you could be here with us in Lubbock, but we also like to take advantage of these opportunities to do things virtually and appreciate you joining us. And I think one of my major roles is to thank Atul. Atul will do a wonderful job of thanking everyone else. And when he talks about the person behind the machine or whatever, I mean, Atul is a machine. He's a force of nature. We're so excited to have you with us, Atul, and so appreciate all of these opportunities that you provide, not only for our students, staff, and faculty, but provide for us to connect with people around the globe on these really important topics. And I know you will thank Carlton Whitehead, but I also want to do that as he was a former professor of management in the Rawls College. I want to thank Carlton for and his family for support of these presentations. So Atul, thank you. Kimberly, Bill, thank you for being here with us today as well.
Thank you very much, Dean Williams, and greatly appreciate your support behind it, as well as the fact that this event has been made possible with the generous grant of the Carlton Whitehead family. I would say Professor Carlton Whitehead family. Professor Carlton Whitehead, through his generous grant, has made this leadership talks possible for us. And incidentally, in addition to Professor Carlton Whitehead's support, we have had the family, and one of the persons in the family is Tara Whitehead, who is Bill Carr's contemporary from Emory University. In fact, Tara is online, but she will not be on camera right now. But It's fun to have both Bill Carr and Tara Whitehead together, at least in one session after many years. I won't tell you the number of years it has been, but both of them have been contemporaries. And thank you very much to Professor Carlton Whitehead, as well as to the family for their support. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our platinum sponsor for the Center for Sales and Customer Relationship Excellence, Mr. Hank Doris, and his family for their generous support and for the continued encouragement to the center and center's programs. With that, let me take this opportunity to also mention a couple of things before introducing Bill Carr. First and foremost, the two people behind all these activities is Julie Doss, who is our Senior Director for External Relations, and Mr. Matthew Winfrey. Matthew is the one who makes all the technical things possible. So if in case there is something that you find technically there, you could just kind of send a note or put it into the Q&A or in the chat box for them to take care of. But certainly, we would encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. After Mr. Bill Carr's initial presentation, we will take up the questions from the audience. And so we would encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. And both Kimberly and I will be in conversation with Mr. Bill Carr. But let me give you a quick background about him. Matthew, could we have his background, please? Thank you. I wanted to make sure that you also see his latest book, at least a picture of the latest book, so that you're aware that he is a best-selling author. The book just came out in, I think, end of February, and already on the bestseller list in Amazon and other places. The book called Working Backwards. Bill is a co-author with his colleague, Colin Breyer. Bill and I go a long way, so I won't tell you all the details. I'll let Bill talk about that. But Bill was somebody who has been responsible for a number of innovative ideas at Amazon. He joined there in 1999 and spent more than 15 years with the company. As the Vice President of Digital Media, Bill launched and managed company's global digital music, video business, including Amazon Music, Prime Video, and Amazon Studios. He's been responsible for many successes, also the person who has been, as he calls himself, both in the driver's seat as well as the passenger seat for other devices such as Kindle or Echo, as well as several other products. Some of them, there are some failures as well, which he's going to talk about and the experiences from that. Bill has been also, he's left Amazon about a few years ago, but since then, he's also been active as an executive in residence with Mavron, which is an early stage consumer-only venture capital company. He later served as the chief operating officer of OfferUp, the largest mobile marketplace for local buyers and sellers in the US. Today, he has co-founded a company called Working Backwards, along with his co-author, Colin Breyer, where he coaches executives at large and early stage companies on how to implement the management practices developed at Amazon. Bill got his BA from Colby College in 1989 and his MBA from Goizueta Business School, Emory University in 1994. That's where Bill and I met. Bill, over to you. And
all right. Thank you so much, Atul, for that generous introduction. Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Dean Williams. Thank you to the Texas Tech community for giving me this opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm going to do a bit of gymnastics here to put my slides forward. Give me one moment here. All right. Looks like it's working. So great. Yeah, so I want to acknowledge Atul for a moment here. So he was one of those professors and mentors who was consequential in my life. It was, boy, a long time ago, the early 90s when I was in business school at Emory. people, professors like Atul, who took a real interest in me and coached and mentored me and taught, had a great class as well. So I just want to thank Atul because I wouldn't be here without him. So I won't reintroduce myself because Atul has done an excellent job of that. I will just actually speak briefly for a moment, though, about my co-author, Colin Breyer. So, and this is important because of the context for the book. So Colin spent 12 years at Amazon. He joined a year before me. His role was, he started off as a program manager. He was a more technically oriented leader. But the most notable part of Colin's experience was that he spent 2 years, 2003 to 2005, as Jeff Bezos' technical assistant. In most companies, this would be known as a chief of staff role. So he literally spent 2 years for 10 hours a day for 2 years, going to every meeting with Jeff and a lot of one-on-one time too. And this is notable because it turns out that this period of time, 2003 to about 2006, ended up being one of the most important eras for Amazon. And I'll get to that in just a minute. So I want to talk a little bit about the background for why Colin and I wrote this book. So after I had left Amazon, I was just a little over 3 years ago when I was with Mavron, venture capital firm. I was at the offsite for the company along with their other portfolio CEOs. And the co-founder of Mavron, Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks. And there was a breakout session where the topic of Amazon came up. And Howard said, Amazon, I don't understand how Amazon does it. How have they been so successful in everything from cloud computing to digital media and devices to e-commerce and to logistics? We're still trying to get the retail coffee business right. And as you might imagine, I was rather struck by the fact that Howard Schultz was so mystified by Amazon's success. And in fact, I shared this discussion, this encounter with Colin a few days later. And we realized that this question that Howard asked, how has Amazon done it? How do they do it? Comes up a lot, whether it's in the press, people we talk to. But we also realized that there was no single source of information that could answer this question for people. There's no book that really gives this insight. Plenty of articles, but those aren't very accurate either. So we also realized that based on our experience, the specific roles we had at a specific time, that we actually had a front row seat to this amazing transformation the company went through. And we realized that we could actually codify this in a way that into a set of scalable, repeatable processes that Amazon developed that any company, large or small, B2B, B2C could use. And so that was our motivation then to go ahead and write this book. Really our goal here is to pass this on to the next generation of business leaders. That's you. So everyone knows about these successful products: Amazon Prime, AWS, Kindle, Prime Video, Echo, Alexa. Lots has been written about them. A couple things you don't know. Number one, these businesses that I've listed here, along with one other, Fulfillment by Amazon, every single one of them was either launched or the teams were founded and conceived of between 2003 and 2006. The second thing people don't realize is that they have one thing in common, which was there was a common management operating system that Amazon developed in that same window of time that was used to build each one of these businesses. And so what is that common management operating system? It's called the Amazon Invention machine. And we didn't make up this name. Actually, Jeff called it, referred it to Amazon this way once. And so what we've done, though, is try to make this accessible to all of you. So as this graphic shows, the Invention machine is comprised of a set of leadership principles that are deeply embedded into 5 scalable, repeatable processes that define how the company hires, how they do organization structure, how communication and decision-making happens, how they develop new products, and finally, how they manage metrics and manage the business day to day. So I want to talk about this because this invention machine can work for you too. Let's dive in. Let me describe the component parts to you. So the first part is the leadership principles. And don't worry, I'm not going to read through all 14 leadership principles here. We talk about these in the book, or you can always just Google Amazon leadership principles to access these. So why am I talking about these? Many companies, almost all company has some set of principles or values. Well, the big difference between these principles and other companies is that these principles have teeth, meaning in a lot of companies, they have a set of values or principles that are merely posters on a wall. Like when you walk into one of those break rooms and it has one of those posters that says teamwork where everyone's rowing, but it doesn't mean anything about how the company actually operates. In Amazon's case, not only were each one of these principles carefully crafted to reflect and define what does role model leadership and how should decisions be made at Amazon, but then there are a set of processes and mechanisms that were built specifically to reinforce and cause work to be done and decisions to be made and people to be hired based on these principles. So when the CEO is not in the room, you can fall back on these principles to actually help you make the right decision. All right, let me get into the processes that are scalable and repeatable and designed to reinforce these principles. So each one of these processes was actually a solution to a common problem that all companies had, but Amazon just came up with, in many cases, an unconventional or different approach. So in this case, the problem occurred a little before the 2003-2005 window. It occurred in 1999, the year I joined the company, and that was the dot-com boom. The company was growing like a weed. And to quote one leader, we had new people hiring new people, hiring new people. And if you are in that situation as a company, what will happen is that your culture will be rapidly diluted if you don't have an intentional hiring process. And the reason for that is if it's left up to each individual to decide who should be brought into the company, then you will get a random dog's breakfast of different cultures and leaders in the company. So the solution to this problem is called the Amazon bar raiser process. And here are a few key elements for you to know. First of all, interviewers can't just ask whatever questions they want. They are assigned specific data to collect. And the data they're supposed to collect is they're assigned 2 or 3 of each leadership principle to go and focus on exclusively in the interview and use behavioral-based interviewing techniques, meaning examples from that person's past experience, to help them understand whether the candidate meets or does not meet the bar for each one of the leadership principles they're assigned. They need to take copious notes. They need to write up a full assessment and make a recommendation to hire or no hire, and they need to defend that assessment. And then finally, there's a debrief meeting where then the collection of interviewers will come together to read everyone's notes so that they get a complete picture of how the candidate related to all 14 principles. And then they will debate and discuss whether the candidate meets the bar. And the criteria are the leadership principles, not whatever criteria each interviewer thinks is important to them. These different methods tend to make the process more objective, to help to remove personal biases. And then there's a special person in the process named the bar raiser whose job is to remove a pervasive bias called urgency bias, which is that a hiring manager who has 1 or more openings is desperate to fill those openings and will want to do it as fast as possible. And in some cases, that means hiring the next person with a pulse that walks through the door. And to resist that bias, the bar raiser is there to make sure the process is followed. And actually, this person has veto power over the hiring manager to ensure that the candidate actually meets or exceeds the bar that Amazon has set for the leadership principles. And so many of you in this community, by the way, are early in your career and you're looking to interview, and some of you may be looking to interview at Amazon. A tip I have for you is, which I give to anyone who wants to interview with the company, is go study the Amazon leadership principles carefully and write down examples of work you've done and how it comports to those principles. By the way, this same process can be very helpful for you for interviewing for many other companies. Know that company and come up with salient examples that speak to the culture and leadership style of that company. Okay, let's move on to the next process, which is how Amazon organizes itself into teams. So again, this was a specific solution to a specific problem. In this case, the problem was in the early 2000s, the company was growing very quickly, but our businesses became more diverse. We weren't just a book business in the United States. We were books, music, electronics, apparel, a partnership with Toys R Us, a partnership with Target, Germany, UK, France. We had a complex set of business requirements coming into our software development engineering team, and we were getting completely bogged down and stuck. So we took the conventional route first. We actually adopted a process from GE called the NPI process and we did what most companies do, which is we increased the level of communication and collaboration in the company and planning to make sure that we could actually agree of the central planning system for how to get work done. Well, after a year of that, we rejected this process because we were spending so much time planning and coordinating and so little time now building on behalf of customers that not only was it hurting the business, but it was no fun to work at such a company. Instead, we wanted to empower teams and empower leaders. So we created small, single-threaded focus teams that were separate from each other. And in each one of these teams, there'd be a leader who would focus, who could span the technical and non-technical requirements and would have all the resources they need in their one team. And in some cases, those smaller teams would nest into larger teams, but they'd be more autonomous, and then you would have loose coordination across the company. What we discovered was this was the way for us to remain innovative and nimble. To quote Dave Limp, who's the senior vice president of the device business at Amazon, the best way for a company to fail at inventing something is to make it somebody's part-time job. And we had countless examples of where we took leaders, took them out of managing big businesses, in my case, the physical media business. In another case, a leader, Tom Taylor, who was a huge manager of the operations business, and then focused them on one project. In Tom's case, that project was fulfillment by Amazon, which is a huge business for the company, but was stuck in committee until we moved him off of his role in operations as a vice president and to focus on nothing else than fulfillment by Amazon. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is how the company communicates. So some of you may have heard about this because Amazon is somewhat famous or infamous for this. But in fact, it's actually a very old school approach, which is that Amazon doesn't conduct internal meetings using PowerPoint as its mechanism for communication and discussion. It uses written documents or narratives. And in most cases, for a 1-hour meeting, these narratives are limited to a maximum length of 6 pages. And the origin of this, again, was a simple problem. In 2004, my co-author Colin was spending a lot of time with Jeff in his executive staff meeting, and Jeff was frustrated that they really weren't making the right progress. They had to have teams come back again and again. They weren't really feeling like they could actually make effective decisions and conduct effective meetings. So they tried something different. They said they were influenced by Edward Tufte, the Yale professor, who was writing about the benefits of using written documents instead of PowerPoint. And so we sent out the edict to say that from now on, those meetings with Jeff will be conducted with a written narrative. And it's important to note, by the way, that this was an experiment. And if the experiment had failed, we could have gone back to PowerPoint or could have just gone and tried something else. But it's important to note that Amazon wasn't afraid to experiment, wasn't afraid to reject a commonly used method for a decision for meetings in most companies around the world. And so at first it was difficult. At first, the first few narratives were terrible, too long or poorly written. But over time, over the course of weeks and months, they got better and better. And what did we find? We found that narratives are a superior method for conducting meetings and decision-making because, number one, they force the team and author of that narrative to synthesize their thinking and think through the problems in a much clearer way. They will have debated and discussed and really understand the problems in their business deeply in the writing of that document alone. The second thing we discovered is that ideas matter, not presentation. So a lot of times with PowerPoint, the winner is the one with the best presentation skills and the best slideware, where what really matters is the idea underneath. Finally, what we also realized is that you can transmit more information and data faster and more effectively in a written document. So this is just simple math. People can read 2 to 3 times faster than they can listen to someone talk. And the pixel density is 7 to 9 times higher in a Word document versus a PowerPoint deck. So the way an Amazon meeting works is that people pass out the document at the beginning of the meeting. People read it in silence for 20 minutes, make notes. And then for 40 minutes, you have a deep discussion where then everyone is on the same page because everyone has the same information and a lot more information. And then you can have 40 minutes of a high fidelity, high quality conversation. So when I think about that question that Howard asked, one of the first things I would point out to him is that Jeff Bezos and the other executive leaders at the company are somewhere between 3 and 7 times more deeply informed about their various businesses of the company because they use this meeting method, which allows them to actually span a much more diverse set of businesses than you could if you're using a narrow and less effective communication method like PowerPoint. The next process to talk about is actually the title of the book. It's the Working Backwards PRFAQ process. This process takes its cue from the leadership principle customer obsession, which says that great leaders at Amazon start with the customer and work backwards. So this process was developed to actually create a mechanism so that in fact, when people are doing work at Amazon, they do in fact start with the customer and work backwards. And let me tell you why. So in the early days of digital media, when I moved over to be one of the founding leaders for that business in 2004, we spent much of that year actually just in front of Jeff, going out, meeting with companies, researching different ideas, and then presenting to Jeff to say, here's what we think we should go build in the digital media business. But when we started out, we actually were using a lot of the traditional tools that we'd learned in business school. We made spreadsheets that talked about what's the total addressable market, what would be our market segment share, what would be the margin characteristics. We would maybe make a SWOT analysis. And the problem with all that was that Jeff would look at this information, but just look up from it and say, I don't get it. What's the customer experience you want to build? Why don't you show me the mock-ups? And so for those that don't know, mock-ups mean a design of a website or application experience. And we tried that process, but in fact, it's very heavyweight to create high quality mock-ups. You need a great designer, it takes a lot of time. And to fast forward on this story, through a process of iteration and trial and error, eventually we landed on, instead, let's try writing a press release, a simple one-page press release, which is a lightweight process. Anyone can write one. And in that one page, when you write a press release, you are hyper-focused on what is the customer, who's my customer, what's their problem, and how does this product solve that problem? Why will they care enough to get up out of their chair, go to a store, go online and buy this thing? And so by doing so, we would start, and we also would, by the way, free ourselves from worrying about the constraints of what we were good at or what capabilities we had. And we use this to develop, for example, both not only the Kindle, one of the first digital media products, but also AWS. And we spent, in many cases, months of a process of iterating on PRs and FAQs to do this. The second part of the process, the press release, after the press release is the frequently asked question. And these are questions that basically either a customer would ask or internal questions like, how big is the team you needed to build this? What technical problems do you need to solve? And when you combine these two things together by starting with the customer, then you work backwards to then describe, well, what will I need to do and solve and build in order to actually realize this product vision? This mechanism has been used at Amazon ever since 2005 to develop every new product and feature at the company. Finally, I want to talk about metrics. So most people who join Amazon are surprised by how little time is spent debating and discussing financial output metrics like revenue, gross margin, and free cash flow, and how much time is spent talking about controllable customer-facing input metrics. Okay, so what does that mean? A controllable customer-facing input metric are the things that the management team actually has able to apply resources to actually affect their business to then result in the right output metrics. So what's a good example? The retail business. There are really 3 controllable inputs in retail, whether you're Amazon or whether you're Target or Walmart. What's the item selection on your shelf or virtual shelf? How competitive and sharp are those prices relative to competition? And how convenient and easy is it for your customers to get that item from you, whether that means driving to the store, getting in and out of the store, or it means going online and click and deliver. How long does it take to get to your home? And what Amazon figured out is by rigorously figuring out what are all the many, many metrics that feed into each one of those inputs, and by rigorously focusing on those metrics and applying different tactics and strategies to move and change those metrics over time, that you will actually get the right outputs. Instead, if you have focus on outputs, like you have 2 weeks left in the quarter and you say, what are we going to do to hit our revenue number? You will actually engage in unnatural activities that will not really create long-term value for the customer, and will probably, in fact, that short-term thinking will actually hurt your company. So all these 5 scalable, repeatable processes combined with the leadership principles, these comprise the Amazon Invention machine, which is a system, a management OS that really anyone can use. And so, again, I've taken you a whirlwind tour through it. There's a 300-page book that describes these things in details, along with some case studies. I would encourage you to read it. Before we jump into questions, I want to talk about one more thing, since many of you are early in your careers, and I want to give you a bit of career advice. And that advice is to be like Andy. For those of you who don't know who Andy is, that's Andy Jassy. Andy is going to be the second, about a month ago, it was announced that Andy will become the second CEO of Amazon.com after Jeff Bezos. He is today the CEO of Amazon Web Services. And I know Andy pretty well, since I worked alongside him for my 15 years at the company. So let me give you some lessons that you can observe about how Andy managed his career that you can apply to your world. So number one, Andy thought long-term. So when Andy graduated from business school, Harvard Business School, he could have taken any job. He could have gone to BCG or McKinsey or one of the big banks. He didn't go for the highest salary, though. He went for what he thought was the best opportunity, which is he went to Amazon back in 1997. And he went there because he saw a company where it was growing, a company where he thought he could make an impact, a company where he thought he could learn from talented people, and where he could learn by taking on a variety of challenges. The second thing is that Andy faced a lot of setbacks. So Andy landed in the marketing department at Amazon in his first role. And unfortunately, that was a bad place to land. So the VP of that department would get fired about every 9 months. It was not one of the best roles to land in. And some of his peers were getting promoted above him. And in fact, at one point, several years in, when it looked like he might become the head of marketing, he had some competition from a newly hired outsider who was flashier and good at impressing the senior executives. And so Andy had to overcome those early setbacks. But he also took calculated risks. So eventually he got this role as Jeff's technical advisor. And after that role, he could have taken any job in the company. But he decided, I'm going to go focus on this nascent technology of web services. And I'm going to see if we can actually create a business out of this and create a real product plan. So he took a real risk. And he was adaptable. By focusing on web services, he had to understand the deep technical issues there. And he had a non-technical marketing-based background. And he was patient. There was about an 18-month incubation period for AWS. The very first services like Mechanical Turk weren't successful. It was fully 10 plus years into his career at Amazon before it was clear that Amazon Web Services was something. And then finally, he worked long, hard, and smart. There's no substitute for this, folks. I don't care where you're working. If you work long, hard, and smart, that will help advance your career. So with that, thank you very much for your time today. You can find a little bit more information on our website. I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you. That was a great whirlwind tour of your book, Bill, and you summed up the Amazonian principles, the secrets, very, very well. And of course, there are many questions that are going to come in. But before I delve into the rest of the questions, and I want to invite Kimberly as well in the conversation with you. Together we have some questions, but my first question to you relates to your career, Bill. I want to go before Amazon. You started your career in sales, and
Yes.
because we are part of the sales center, so I want to put the question to you that you started a career in sales. You started first with Procter & Gamble. You worked in the sales arena, then you became the account analyst for Kmart as one of your business. So tell us a little bit about the journey that you had early on. We met when you were still in Procter & Gamble. I remember those days, when you were also, I had some long conversations with you on the customer business development side. So
Yes.
tell us about the learning there that you brought into Amazon, and then you got this amazing role to play.
Well, in addition to that, Atul, which you may not know, is I had 3 years of sales experience before I went to business school as well, including field sales role with the subsidiary of Pitney Bowes, selling dictation systems, and then I was with Procter & Gamble. So I would say that here the great thing about starting in sales is that for those of you who are in sales, you'll know that the number one thing to understand as a sales rep is that you're not going to sell. The only way you're going to sell stuff is if you take action today. Your actions today will define whether you end up selling something tomorrow. And you have to think, you have to have that urgency every day to realize that it is up to you. Your energy, your motivation is going to make things happen. And I would say that is an excellent foundation from which to build your career, because if I had to point to one thing that may have separated me once I got to Amazon versus people who in many cases may have been more intellectually gifted or may have been more academically credentialed than I was that I understood that each and every day, if I would go be hyper focused on what is the most efficient thing I need to focus on, how do I go make that happen?
That is an outstanding advice also to our young students who are looking towards a future career. Let's continue the conversation a little bit more about the fact that what motivated you to get into technology. You knew that Amazon was both a technology as well as a kind of a marketplace building, and you got into that role. And in between I think Procter & Gamble and Amazon, you were in eBay, if I'm not mistaken. So tell us a little bit about what kind of motivated you to get into that.
Well, honestly, I've been fascinated by the idea of being in a tech company since I was in 10th grade. My father brought home one of the earliest, I'm really dating myself here. My father brought home one of the earliest IBM PCs when I was in middle school. I remember doing some simple programming on the first, Apple IIs. I didn't have the technical interest and aptitude to become a software development engineer, but I always saw that I was excited by what technology, what computers could do. And so, in many ways, my, time at Procter & Gamble is sort of was a departure from what I was really passionate about, which was how do I go work in a tech company? So after Procter & Gamble, I went to work for an early stage tech startup called Iver. And what I learned from that, I learned a lot about what a not so functional tech startup where you have not found product market fit looks like. We can talk more about that if you want. But the combination, frankly, of that Procter & Gamble experience with being at a tech startup served me extremely well when I got to Amazon, because I had learned a bunch about retail by being an analyst on the Kmart account team. I had learned about what you're trying to accomplish at an early stage technology company, and Amazon was kind of both of those things. So I was really fortunate to figure out that my career path sort of led me here, but it wasn't completely intentional, I have to tell you.
Right, and actually, one of the other things which you highlight in the book, right up front, and you talk about Jeff's own. You quote him on something, if I'm not mistaken, that we have an unshakable conviction for the long-term interests of share owners are perfectly aligned with that of the interest of the customers. So tell us more about this customer focus approach and what led towards customer first approach of Amazon.
Yeah, so that statement, many of you listening to that statement say like, oh, sure, that sounds obvious and that's easy, and I'll make sure that I always work that way. But when you get inside a company, that's actually incredibly hard to do for a number of reasons. Number one, nearly all companies are subject to the pressures to hit quarterly revenue numbers and objectives. And in many cases, the kinds of things and activities you might engage in to hit those numbers tend not to be very customer focused. Like, for example, if you decide, well, we really need to get our working capital down, so let's find a way to really reduce our inventory in a big way, like maybe send a bunch of it back to the manufacturers. That's not really good for customers because now you have fewer items to offer them. I could give you many more examples.
But I think I want to touch on something related to that. There are twin factors. The long-term orientation for the customers, and in your book, you kind of talk about the fact that everybody in Amazon who are in Seattle office, their base salary is not more than $160,000, and you don't get bonus, and everything you get is in terms of shares. So how did Amazon create and inculcate this culture of innovation, invention, and kind of long-term orientation towards the customer without making compensation, obviously just directly pay people on short-term returns to long-term perspective?
Yep. And the one part of the answer is it's actually a lot of things. It's about actually the CEO having a very intentional efforts to achieve what you just described. And just one of them was compensation. So in a lot of companies, leaders are paid based off of hitting financial goals in a quarter or a year. And if your compensation is heavily tied towards hitting a specific revenue goal or a specific profit goal for a year, there are all kinds of short-term optimizations you'll make. A great example of this was the digital media business. I was working, we were a relatively small player in the relative global scheme of things for media products. And I was working with the largest, media companies in the world, Disney, Warner, and because all of their executives were bonused off of hitting some goal for a quarter, they did short-term things. A great example of the short-term thing they did is they created Netflix. Netflix came in and said, I will give you X amount of money, X millions of dollars, if you'll let me have this movie exclusively on my service to stream it or non-exclusively. And that money would allow them to achieve their revenue goal for that month or quarter and their bonus. Well, if they had just taken a step back and say, well, if I do that, then over time you might become a very large and build a subscriber base and actually have a better media product than the smart long-term thing for me to do would actually to not give you those films. That's my core asset, and to start building out my own B2C infrastructure of streaming applications, which now, by the way, they're all hurrying to catch up to do because they thought so short-term for so long. There wouldn't have even been a Netflix or a Prime Video if they had not enabled us.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I think I've got many more questions just coming up, and there are many people who are putting in the question, but let me first pass on to Kimberly, and she has some interesting questions for you regarding what can the new entrepreneurs learn about this? Startup companies, what can they learn? Kimberly.
Yes, thank you, Atul. And thank you, Bill, for sharing your story. It's super inspiring. Amazon is considered one of the most innovative companies in the world. Can you share some insights to those who want to be innovators and entrepreneurs and tell us maybe what the first step would be in your mind for a startup to become an invention machine?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we both wrote this book, which is that there are actually real tools you can use. And, the primary tool I would use is this PRFAQ tool. And the reason why is just, you don't need a team of people to go do that. You yourself in your apartment, your dorm room, you can go write out press releases and frequently and FAQ documents. And you're not going to come up with like the next AWS idea on your first try, it takes a lot of time and effort and patience, but it's a lightweight enough process that it gives you the tool to stay customer focused and the right framework for how to think about the problem. What is a hard problem for customers that if you solve it leads to a very big marketplace? And then what is the solution that if you create it elegantly, they will care enough about? And that framework of the PRFAQ gives you a way to go iterate through lots and lots of ideas and problems. And then when you have one you think is a really good one, you can share it around with people and say, what do you think of this idea? So that's one. The other part is like, you have to be patient and think long-term. As I gave you the example in the story, Andy Jassy and his team, they spent 18 months incubating, writing PRFAQs. I mean, he had a small team, but even the few software engineers he had were complaining to say, doesn't Jeff Bezos know that they pay us to write code, not write Word documents? They didn't start building AWS until they had gotten it right. So the biggest mistake I see people make in early stage companies and even in larger companies is to rush to go build something. You want to actually spend a lot of time up front thinking about what it is you want to build. And then once you have it right, then go rush and build it.
So Bill, talking about what you want to build, that's the most interesting thing, what customer experience you want to create. I have a question regarding that. How bold could the people be in terms of what they want to create as an experience? How much did you allow the people to say, okay, because a lot of people say, oh, we got to think about customer experience, but they're not bold enough to think about the customer experience. So how bold were you to think about the customer experience?
Well, you want to, it's scary to be bold, but yes, if you think about the biggest companies in the world, they were bold. And in some cases, the solution was relatively simple and elegant. Google said, well, we want to help organize and make accessible all the world's information. That is an incredibly bold vision for a couple of PhDs to have in their over at Stanford. But their solution was somewhat actually relatively simple and elegant. It obviously, in terms of how to create a better search engine that would reference, how other web pages referred to each other. So, but the bolder your vision, the bigger the addressable market, the bigger the prize. If your vision is so small that when you go solve it, you realize, oh, I've done a great job of solving a problem that has the potential to be a $10 million idea, that's just not very interesting. You want to try to solve a problem that is like 100 billion, could be a $100 billion idea. Of course, if this were easy to do, people would be doing it every day, but it's better to be bold.
Very interesting. You have a question regarding that, Kimberly?
Yeah, well, one of the things, Bill, that you are circling around is this thing called product market fit. And it's one of the reasons that startups fail. And that tool that you just described was very interesting to me. Something that we're doing here at the Rawls College of Business and within our Innovation Center is this thing called the National Science Foundation I-Corps program. And it's all about teaching students customer discovery. And so it's really peeling back those layers around making sure that they've identified a problem and that they are face-to-face with customers. And so it's really interesting to me that is one of the heart of one of those processes in your book. It's actually pretty fascinating, and I think it's reassuring to know that this is part of the STEM MBA program at the Rawls College of Business. But I have another question. You have had, and it's in your bio says that you were executive in residence with Maverick. So what can you help the audience understand about how you identified deals and technologies or innovations that you would invest in? Can you kind of walk through what that might look like for the audience?
Well, at a typical venture capital firm, sort of each partner may have a specific, the firm itself may have a specific thesis for how they think about investing. And once you are an entrepreneur and have an idea, it would serve you well to sort of understand, each firm and what their focus is. There's venture firm here in Seattle called Madrona, which was one of the earliest investors in Amazon, but they really only focus on Pacific Northwest companies. So Mavron, which is based in Seattle and San Francisco, only focuses on consumer-facing companies. So one thing is to understand what is the focus area for the company, and then within the company, within the VC, what are the focus areas for each partners? They will tend to have some area where they get deep on some subject matter, whether it's the apparel business or whether it's VR and AR, you name it, they will have their areas of specialty. The thing that I often heard that might be a couple things that are useful when we would be, I'd be sitting in their partner meetings, they would talk about what are they looking for in a CEO. And actually I sat down with Mark Andreessen from Andreessen Horowitz, and he once described this to me too. It's relatively consistent across the community, which is to be a successful startup CEO, you need to be able to do three things. One is you need to be able to go fundraise. That in itself is a specific skill. Like, how do you go out to the venture community and angel community and raise money? The second thing is you have to have a good idea. The idea has to be one that's compelling. If it's it can't be a Me Too idea. It's not worth very much to solve a problem that someone else has already solved. You have to be solving an interesting, an idea with a big total addressable market, and you need to have a new and different approach to that idea that is compelling. And then third is then you need to be able to show that you can operate and run that company once it gets up on its feet. And those are three, most people aren't an A+ at all three of those things. But you need to develop some ability to understand how to do each one to be a successful entrepreneur.
Very interesting. Bill, there's a question from your friend, Tara Whitehead. And I would like, let me read her question and then probably, relate something to the example that you have. She says, this is a very well thought out approach to drive success, and it has clearly been successful. Can you give us insight into a project that failed and Amazon managed through it? And I think I want I'm adding from my side, the example of Amazon Unbox might be a very good example to kind of talk about.
Yeah, good question. Hello, Tara. I'm glad you found this useful. So Jeff has often said that if you want to be an innovative company, then you need to be prepared for and be willing to accept failure, because invention and failure go hand in hand. You can't say, I'm going to be innovative and only invent. So for example, WD-40, that product, that stands for water displacement test number 40, which means 39 other versions of that product failed before they got to the 40th. There are many failures at Amazon. One I'll talk about is a personal one, which is the very first version of what is now known as Prime Video was called Amazon Unbox, which first of all, Jeff and I picked that name together, and years later we would both lament that we were both idiots to come up with that name. So the name itself wasn't very good, but the product wasn't very good either. It was a product where you could only download your movies and TV shows to a PC. This was partly due to the, those of you may not remember that, but back in the days of 2006, streaming video wasn't really a thing yet. You couldn't stream video to your TV. So we had many technical limitations. We didn't do a good enough job of testing the software itself. And so it was buggy. In many cases, people couldn't actually get their download or it wouldn't play. And, after this launched and it didn't go very well, I had a really tough meeting with Jeff on this topic. And in many companies, I probably would have just been fired for this. But I heard Jeff say many, many times to people in my situation, why would I fire you now? I just made a multi-million-dollar investment in you. Your job now is to pay forward that investment by learning from your failure, teaching others about what you learned from that failure, and making sure not to repeat the same mistake again. And I would venture to say that the various mistakes that I make, which I catalog in the book, I carry those scars with me every day, and in the intervening years have applied those learnings to hopefully build much more successful products. But if you work at it long enough, you'll still have plenty of other failures.
I think that's very interesting because that leads to the second question which is coming in from my colleague, Dr. Alejandra Marin. She's saying, if working backwards starts with the customer, how does Amazon learn and study the customer? So learning, you're saying learn from failures and success.
Good question.
Yeah.
Good question. I get this question a lot. Like people ask, well, is the best way to come up with ideas, is it like some marketing research technique like focus groups or surveys, or what's the super special, research technique? Amazon has no super special customer research techniques. In fact, the at a simplest level, the technique was to what we say we would swim in data. So for example, let's talk about Amazon Prime. Before Amazon Prime existed, it wasn't very hard to figure out like what were the top 3 things that prevented people from shopping and buying from Amazon more often. I don't like paying for shipping, or it takes too long to get to me. We're always in the top 4 responses. So it wasn't rocket science. Like it didn't require any sophisticated techniques to figure out, hey, people don't like paying for shipping and they wanted to get to them faster. The hard part was coming up with, how do we develop a program that's economically viable for us that will allow, and how do we then restructure our operations to enable that feature? But to answer your question more directly, sit in with your customer support team, listen to just stay close to the customer, listen to the calls coming into customer support, or read them in the transcripts, or look carefully, going back to controllable input metrics. You need to have metrics that are telling you what the customer experience is. What % of the time, when we promised a customer that your package would arrive in Prime in 2 days, what percentage of the time did we miss that promise? And then once you get that metric, dive into that to understand, why did you miss the promise? Was that a function of some specific fulfillment center, some specific product? So diving deeper, peeling back the layers of the onion on customer-facing controllable input metrics.
I think there's a question that relates to the metrics from Danny on this one. He's asking for some interesting examples of the metrics. So you just gave one example, and one of the things that people often talk about is there's a difference between key performance indicators that actually help in terms of achieving success versus sometimes what we look in the outcome metrics. So
right.
Can you talk a little bit about the key performance that you just mentioned, and Danny's got that question there.
Yeah, so it's not easy to actually come up with the right metrics. So a simple example of this is in the early 2000s when we were looking to add more selection to the Amazon website. The senior leadership gave the instruction to the buyers to say, we need to add way more selection. So I want, here's a big goal for every one of you for how many more items you need to add, whether you're buying toys or apparel or whatever. And so the metric was just how many more new items could they add to the catalog, new detail pages on Amazon. And they went and did that. And guess what it resulted in? It resulted in a bunch of stuff that people didn't want to actually buy. They sort of went to merchants and manufacturers that could offer them, say, 100,000 SKUs, but maybe only 100 of those SKUs were actually really popular with customers. So then you had all kinds of inventory in your warehouse that you didn't want. You hadn't actually solved the output problem, which was you want more sales. It wasn't until about the 4th iteration on this metric, which started off with the number of product detail pages. Then it was like, the number of product detail pages where it's actually in stock. Well, it's the number of product detail pages where it's actually in stock, but it's demand weighted by which detail pages are actually being viewed by customers. And then finally, not just in stock, but in stock in a Prime pickable location, so that then when we say it's available for Prime, we can actually fulfill that promise. So you have to, it is a journey. It's a constant journey to make sure that you understand. And that's just one example. And I can give you 100 others of how you have to drill down to get to your actual controllable input metric.
And there's one more related question that I want to, before I go back to Kimberly, is one more related question from Noah. She's asking about, as far as working backward goes, what's the next after developing this PR note statement? The 6-page, the 1-page PR note that you talked about, the 6-page initial document, and then so understanding the desired customer experience, then after that what?
Well, the what is typically actually described in the FAQ. Your FAQ would describe to say, so to launch this product, I will need to hire a team of X people comprised of this and that. Or if you're an entrepreneur, by the way, this is an excellent tool. We need to raise $20 million, or we need to raise a seed fund of $1 million. And with that seed fund, I will hire 3 engineers who will build a prototype of X. Like you need to define that in your FAQ. So the FAQ really defines like what is your specific business plan. So it's really kind of a back to the future thing. It used to be when I was in business school, by the way, in the early 90s, when you're pitched to a venture capital firm, in addition to the PowerPoint, you had to have like a 20-page business plan to go with it. And that's what I learned how to do in business schools, how to write that 20-page business plan. So this is lighter weight than the two. This is like a 6-page business plan, but should describe like what are you going to go do?
Interesting. And related to that, there's a question from Huang Tuang, and the question is, what are some opportunity cost trade-offs that we need to identify and understand when building a new technological innovation? So in the plans, do you all insist, or did Amazon insist that people put in the opportunity cost and the trade-off cost, etc.?
Yeah, so that really is, again, that's all the beauty of the FAQ, which is that then you are identifying, for example, I'm going to need to solve for the Amazon Kindle. If I want to be able to sell, I want the price point for the customer to be $299. I don't remember what I think it was $329. If I want the introductory price to be this, then I need the bill of materials to be, and I want to have an X% gross margin, then the bill of materials cannot exceed X. And so then as you are building it up, you understand that constraint, understand those trade-offs. And so, but the point is, by starting with the customer working backwards, if you started from the technology end and said, oh, well, I want, I really think it's cool if it had this feature, and this feature, but then you haven't thought through what price point you're trying to hit. And then you're done, you hand it over to the marketing and sales team and say, well, that's great that you built me this new TV here at Sony, but the price point I need to hit is $750. And this TV will cost us $850 to manufacture. So you have to come up with all those, understand all those trade-offs and choices up front.
Mm-hmm.
Kimberly has a question relating to small versus large enterprises. Kimberly, go please.
Yes, absolutely. So we talked a little bit about teams. I do have another question that I want to follow up about that too. But I think this question that Atul is referring to is that you've been coaching executives. And so is there kind of compare and contrast how you might coach someone in a large company, a Fortune 100 company versus an early stage founder leader who's wearing lots of different hats?
Yeah, so the most notable thing that and where typically Colin and I can be the most useful is that early stage leader who has built a company that's found product market fit. It's growing really fast, but for them, it's the biggest job they've ever had. Everything they're encountering is the first time they've encountered it. Mm-hmm. And the things you need to, the thing that made you successful as a CEO to get to that point was when the company was, say, 50 people or fewer. Your mode of operating there can be defined kind of as the daily stand-up, meaning you would typically bring the whole every morning, the whole team, at 9 o'clock, 9:30, whatever the start time is, everyone will stand up for 30 minutes in front of a whiteboard, and you'll have a mechanism to say, okay, here's what we're working on today. That's a reminder of what our goals are. And you go around the room and talk to each person. Well, once you're growing quickly and you're over, say, 120 people, you can't do the daily stand-up anymore. You have to start actually putting in place. You can't be the CEO, can't be in every decision. They can't hire everyone. They have to start creating processes that allow them to effectively manage the company while the team can go operate and effectively without them. And so we saw Jeff Bezos literally go through this transition. And I got to tell you, at times when I first got there, I wasn't sure if he was going to do it. I wasn't sure if he could figure this out. But he did. And when he realized, I can't do this alone, I have to figure out how to create the right processes and systems. In an established company, established CEO, that's typically what they're good at. They got there typically because they're probably very good at understanding how to manage a large organization that scales across different geographies and put in place systems, how they put in place the right org structure, delegate responsibility, audit the work. But in many cases, when they're working with us, they're looking for us to be a change agent, meaning these unconventional methods that Amazon has, I want to bring one or more of these into my company. How can you help me do that? And so in those cases, I'm coaching them specifically about how do you transform, for example, your metrics process to this input metrics process. And so it's a different relationship in that way.
And there can be a natural tension to give up that control as a founder
Yes.
as well. And so,
Very hard.
yeah, absolutely. And some make it and some don't. And so
That's right.
my next question is about, you've been in lots of leadership roles, in particular at Amazon, and scaling teams and driving operational rigor through innovation, right? So it's a fast-paced, sort of dynamic, catalytic environment. Are there any nuggets that you can share? I mean, clearly you've shared a lot about the operating system, but there's a lot of nuance in that with when you're talking about people and building teams and relationships and based in trust. Maybe kind of talk a little bit about how you were driving that kind of operational success.
Yeah. So in my own way, I had to make that same journey that I just described. I wasn't the CEO, but I was managing, the early digital music and video teams. That organization for a long time it started off like 10 people, then it was 50, but for a long time it was about 150 people. But then once we actually figured it out, I had to go from 150 people to about 1,800 people spread across the globe in a 2.5-year period. And you have to then make this leap for how you're managing very differently. So one thing is that Jeff talks frequently about, as you progress upward and your team and your company matures, you start off focusing on what's the product you need to build. Then you focus on sort of how operationally we're going to do things. And then you move to who. A lot more of it then becomes about realizing to be successful, you need to be very focused on having the right org structure in place and the right people, the right leaders overseeing the right parts of that structure. And that one of the biggest single parts of your job is constantly identifying and looking at the structure you have today and the people you have today, and a combination of coaching and developing those people to be able to then for them to be able to step up and take on bigger responsibilities. But in some cases, they won't make it, and you'll have to actually go out and do a difficult thing of hiring someone from the outside to come in maybe above someone. And then the other part I would just tell you is that the way you get there is, and I see this is sort of the difference between the early stage CEO and the really skilled, experienced one. The early stage CEO is every time there's a problem, they may go on and rant and complain about a specific problem. And their solution to it might just be, I'm going to go and talk to a bunch of people and rush to sort of run in and take action the way that I helped early on, which was my personal one-on-one influence. What I learned is that if you're identifying some specific problem, whether it's, for example, I think we have an attrition problem in a certain department in the company. The answer to these problems is always a process. And I got this coaching from a senior leader named Diego Piacentini, who had come from Apple. And I learned this, that what you learn over time is whenever you have a significant issue, you have to go back to the root cause of the issue. Like, why is this happening? And then put in place, go way upstream and figure out what is the process or processes I need to put in place that will address this and keep it from recurring. Because your personal persuasion, your personal influence, that's not scalable and repeatable. There needs to be some mechanisms or process you put in place to actually address these issues at the root cause.
Bill, one of the things that you mentioned in the book is feedback as collaboration. And as a leader, what kind of a feedback and collaborative feedback did you really engineer?
So, do you mean like performance feedback or feedback about specific, products, projects?
Yeah, products and projects.
So you need to create the right forum for these things to happen. So again, that's the other big lesson I learned is that early stage CEOs don't understand how to create the right forum for how feedback information comes in and how then it goes back out in an effective way. A simple example of this is you need a specific, there are different things you're trying to accomplish. One is what is going on with the business that I have, what's going on with that business right now. And you need to actually have a specific forum where not only you as the CEO, but all of your key leaders and many people below that are actually in a room once a week, looking at the same data together and having and looking at what's things that have happened, good things and bad things, and then having a quick discussion about those things. Because then a lot of learning and teaching and feedback would happen in this what was called the weekly business review at Amazon. An enormous amount of, so if the electronics team ran into a problem with a supplier about inventory, we would talk about it, and I would maybe work on the books team, but I'd be sitting there and I'm listening. I'd learned about what they encountered. And I'd also learn what did Jeff Wilke or Jeff Bezos, the leaders, think about that, and what do they think was the right and appropriate way to manage that problem. And so that's one type of form. Another form is you have a series of initiatives or projects. Don't confuse those things with the existing. Create a separate meeting where you're reviewing, I'm trying to build this new project. You need a way that how are you getting the status about whether you're on track or off track, and how are you having a discussion with the right people each week about how do we get it on, what do we need to do to get it on track or get it off track? And don't confuse that kind of meeting with a different meeting, which is coming up with the ideas of what we should work on in the first place. That would be a different kind of meeting. That's the PRFAQ review. So it's understanding what are the different kinds of decisions and operations that you're trying to run, and creating specific meeting types and forums, and being actually very inclusive and broad in your audience, not doing this in the hallway one-on-one, having an inclusive, broad audience so people can learn from others.
Very interesting. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I want to pick up two questions that are related before we kind of sum it up. The two questions related around motivation. First one relates to, how do you keep yourself motivated when you face difficulties in sales and throughout your career? And related to that, another motivation, not for you, is Noah asked the question, was Andy surprised to be the new CEO? Was he expecting it, or was this something a surprise?
Well, I'll take the Andy part first. If we had this call 10 years ago and you asked me if Jeff decided to, I knew he was never going to retire. That's not going to happen. But if something happened to Jeff and there's a name in the envelope that the board of directors has, who's the next CEO, I would have told you it's Andy Jassy. So I can tell you that from my point of view, and for anyone who was a senior leader at the company, it was not surprising at all that Andy was the second CEO. To be clear, there were other great choices too. Jeff Wilke would have been a great choice as well. There are many talented leaders there. I think, I don't know, how long had Jeff and Andy been talking about this transition? I don't know. I stay in touch with Andy, but that's not something he's going to talk to me about. But I think in many ways, like many things, I was surprised at first to learn the news that Jeff was taking this new role, but when I thought about it more, it actually makes a lot of sense. To be clear, he's going to stay very involved with the company. He's just evolved his role to focus on the things that he's most passionate about. Okay, how do you stay motivated when things aren't going well? So this is a really good question. And for those of you earlier in your career, there are a couple different answers to that question. In some cases, one of the best ways to do it is by being, sorry, this is going to sound corny, but by being customer centric. So when you are focused on customers, and customers are always going to be, somewhat unsatisfied, perpetually unsatisfied. If you're delivering items to them in 5 days, they want it in 2 days. If you're doing 2 days, they want 1 day. If you do 1 day, they want 1 hour. AWS customers, have all kinds of needs as well. If you're focused on them and focused on reading about and thinking about all the ways in which they're not satisfied, and if you strive to satisfy them, it gives you a North Star to focus on the sort of outside of yourself. The other related to that is having a mission for the company that you're passionate about. There were times when in my career I'd been in companies where I thought about, like, what are we doing? What's really the mission of the company? And does this matter to me? Does this matter to me? Because you're going to have those dark times, and how are you going to push through them? The other ways to push through them, honestly, is like make sure you have a good manager, because they will help you push through those times as well. It's much harder when you have a bad manager. You notice I didn't list compensation. Obviously, for all of us, getting to compensation to be able to put your kids through college and put a roof over your head, like, that can be a motivation to get you through it. But ideally, that is secondary to these other things.
We are incredibly proud of you, Bill, what you have accomplished. And we know that you got a long career ahead of you in many ways. And you have given great insights today in your book. I encourage everybody to read it. There are lots of nuggets in there. I've highlighted many places. And I know that given your nature, you will be there to assist many companies, both who are startups as well as larger organizations. A lot of people can learn from you. I've learned, and I'm incredibly proud of that. And at the same time, I'm going to echo the words of Dean Margaret Williams, that when the things settle down, we'd like to see you on campus physically. And I'm very sure Kimberly will agree with me that all the Innovation Hub companies would love to kind of interact with you, and we would love to connect you with them. So thank you so much. Thank all the people in the audience. I want to thank first and foremost also the back end side of things, and the support that is provided by Julie Das and Matthew Winfrey, and my area chair, Dr. Sridhar Madhavam, and Dean Margaret Williams. Thank you, Kimberly, for joining this.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
And thank you, Bill. And of course, I want to thank Professor Carlton Whitehead for the support, and Tara Whitehead and the family for the support, and to all our sponsors. And Bill, thank you so much for spending time. I know you are much sought after. I keep on looking into, from Bloomberg to every TV channel and podcast, they want to have you on the show. Extremely proud of you.
Thank you so much, Tool. It was my
Bill
pleasure.
is the hot ticket these days, huh?
He is. And you'll see him more and more in action, I'm very sure. And many more things to come. So you've done extremely well. So we're extremely proud of you. And Texas Tech would love to have you here. So thank you.
I look forward to visiting in the future.
Thank you. Thank you.
Congrats. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.